Lord of the Mysteries. Chapter 627. Late into the night. Cynthia could vaguely sense the deep pain and helplessness inside Admiral Amarius's heart. Without speaking further, she hugged him tightly and used her company to calm his mood. After a simple dinner, Klein took a hot bath and entered the quietest guest room once again. He got into bed and stared at the ceiling in a daze. Klein knew that with him having fully immersed himself in the character of Admiral Amarius's helplessness towards fate and the pain he needed to hide had resonated with his past experiences. If I hadn't figured out the concept of getting into character and being detached, then I might have lost myself. Heh, this is like some actors in my past life. They get too into character and are unable to detach themselves from it, causing them to suffer from mental problems. And to a beyonder, mental problems might end up magnified. As Klein wallowed in his gloom, he got to learn what kind of person he was. I never expected that a Navy admiral who enjoys a high standing, a demigod saint, would still be faced with such helpless and painful experiences. Strength can bring abundance, but it's not a solution to everything. Everyone wears masks, and this is the truest side of a demigod. Klein watched as the crimson moonlight turned brighter, dyeing all the furniture in the room red. At that moment, through the resonating feelings with Admiral Amarius's experience and the contrasting differences, as well as the experience from his previous acting, Klein established a more multifaceted and realistic image of Amarius. He also gained a clearer picture of his blurry self. A person who's very sentimental, a person from Earth, but to a certain extent, a person who has been reconstructed into a new person because of the fusion with Klein Moretti's memory fragments. A person who didn't spend too much time with the Nighthawks but has had that period of time deeply influence his actions and choices. A person who tries to play safe and is afraid of danger but is able to change his mind at the critical moment. A person who truly wants to skive, eat delicious food, travel, and enjoy life, but he has no choice but to be busy with more important matters. A person who likes beautiful women, but he doesn't give himself up to pleasure to keep to his principles. A person who loves money but is willing to spend large sums of money for his siblings. A person who hides his pain inside while showing a smile to others. A person who's used to lampooning inwardly but appears gentlemanly on the surface. A person who can overcome his psychological traumas but never crosses his bottom line. A person who feels embarrassed for his acting. He's also a guardian, a miserable wretch that is constantly fighting against threats and madness. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he silently added. These thoughts flashed through his mind as he seemed to come into contact with his true self. Without realizing it, Klein fell asleep, his body and mind at peace. Inside the master bedroom, Cynthia had also fallen asleep. She was dressed in a nightgown with her legs bare. She had a few layers of her blanket in between her legs as she gently grinded against them. Her hand subconsciously scratched her skin, forming red streaks across them as tiny bumps were produced. In her dream, she saw the illusory and surreal cosmos, as well as that bright star that emitted its light at her. Her vision was pulled closer to it as she could slowly discern the star. Phew! Klein suddenly awoke from his dream as he still had an indescribable scene still seemingly burned into his eyes. Why did I have such a dream? He frowned as he turned his head in disbelief. Just now, not only had he dreamed of Cynthia, who was dressed in a silk nightgown, but he also had a sexual relationship with her. He even dreamed of the naked body of Demoness of Pleasure Sharon, the exquisite doll-like Miss Sharon, Miss Justice whose looks were relatively blurry, Trissy Cheek, Tracy, and all the beautiful women he had met before. Then, he gave himself up to pleasure, as he engaged in a myriad of positions. To most beyonders and ordinary people, this might have been a normal response from suppressing his body when recently faced with temptation, but as a seer, a dream had a very special meaning. Klein quickly observed his body and realized he was still erect, semen flooding out from his penis and causing stains everywhere. This isn't a seer's dream revelation, but the result of an external influence. There's an enemy. Klein was alarmed as he quickly made up his mind. At the same time, he cautiously got out of bed and quickly changed into his admiral uniform. This way, he had the ninth law charm and creeping hunger on him, equipping him with potent self-preservation powers. As he wasn't clear of the present situation, Klein didn't attempt to head above the gray fog. He continued viewing himself as a Marius. With a staid expression, Klein carefully walked to the door and reached out his hand to grab the handle. At that instant, he seemed to finally find the connection with the real world as he heard the chaos and din outside the door. There were clear chewing sounds, debaucherous moaning, angry roaring, and sharp urging. What exactly happened? Everything was normal just moments ago. Klein gulped a mouthful of saliva as he used cogitation to maintain the necessary calm. He had been using spirit vision to observe the situation outside the villa every day and had not discovered any problems. Where are the Admiral's bodyguards? Where is Secretary Luan? Klein found the entire ordeal strange and terrifying the more he considered the situation before him. He touched the ninth law charm with one hand and made the deep domineering aura emanate, repressing the unease that was wafting through the air. Exerting strength in his left hand, Klein twisted the handle and opened the door. Before he took a step forward, he saw a red-vested attendant sitting opposite him. The attendant had many cooked and raw food placed in front of him. There was steak, mutton, dragon-boned fish, and Orvie lobster. At this moment, the attendant picked up a huge fish that seemed to have just stopped struggling, raised his head, and smiled at Klein with a turbid look. "Admiral, I have always envied your food." His stomach was different from before. It was bloated as though he was 7 or 8 months pregnant. Just as he said that, the attendant raised his arms and bit into the raw dragon-boned fish, forcefully ripping out a piece of thick flesh. Fresh red blood dribbled from the corners of his mouth as his chewing sounds sent a chill down Klein's back. The attendant hurriedly gulped as he swallowed the food in his mouth. His bloated stomach trembled as though he would blow up at any moment. This is the instinctive reaction to restrict one's appetite. Klein observed the attendant carefully, and for some reason, he recalled the tramp stand-in who had died of a sudden illness due to gorging. He didn't spend too much time thinking or making attempts to rescue the attendant who was ravenously consuming the food. This was because he knew that nothing would be effective unless he resolved the matter at its roots. Klein moved his feet and followed his spiritual intuition's guidance, carefully walking towards the master bedroom. At the door, there were 2 maidservants. One of them was sitting on the other as she bent her back, strangling the other by the neck. Wearing a beaming smile, she shook the maidservant beneath her as she hurriedly urged her. Quickly praise me! Quickly praise me! She desires acknowledgement." Klein frowned and took a few steps closer, grabbing onto the collar of the maidservant at the very top. He threw the maidservant to the other side of the wall, slamming her to the wall with a force strong enough to make anyone faint. However, this didn't prevent the maidservant from getting to her feet. The maidservant at the bottom kept yawning without opening her eyes. Even though her neck was being wrangled, she appeared as though she hadn't had enough sleep. Such a scene. Klein instantly had the urge to escape and seek help from the church or military. However, the strongest person on Orvie Island was none other than Admiral Amirius. And I'm Amirius at the moment. However, once the situation turns for the worse, I should flee when the time calls for it. I shouldn't act at the cost of my life. Klein pushed open the ajar master bedroom door, his scalp tingling with numbness. The first thing he heard behind the door was pleasurable moaning that gave itself up to one's primal instincts. Following that, a smell that made his heart race and sent blood gushing to his nether regions inundated his olfactory senses. In addition, there was an eclectic mix of all sorts of bodily fluids. A scene of indulging pleasure couldn't help but surface in Klein's mind right on the heels of that. Klein saw the blonde secretary, Luan. He stood by the door, looking inside with an overlooking and cold manner. His arrogance was extremely real. Upon sensing someone enter, he turned his head and discovered it was Admiral Amirius. His expression and gaze didn't change, as though he was looking at an ordinary, unimportant person. This secretary is usually very reverent, but he's actually such a prideful person. Klein originally wanted to question one who seemed to possess some reason, but he saw him shift his gaze to look into the middle of the master bedroom from a height. He only looks normal. Klein traced Juan's gaze and discovered a fair body that was 3 meters tall in the middle of the master bedroom. It had brownish-green lumps growing on its surface that resembled tree warts. Some parts were cracked open, revealing organs that resembled flowers. It had the bodyguards and the male attendants gathered around it as they either stood or knelt, prostrating or floating as they mated with those organs, letting out deep grunting sounds. The other bodyguards and maidservants of varying numbers were scattered across the carpet, enjoying each other's bodies to their heart's content. In addition, tree warts and flowers grew from the tall fair body, as well as brown branches that extended out as they participated in every promiscuous act of pleasure with the people present. What kind of monster is this? Klein had his knowledge of mysticism overturned once again. He lowered his left palm and prepared for battle. At this moment, the terrifying body which towered 3 meters tall turned a head over. It was a female. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She had a high nose bridge and plump lips. She was none other than the beautiful Cynthia with hints of her youthfulness. As the tree branches danced while the flowers opened, Cynthia looked down at Klein with flushed cheeks as she said with hints of embarrassment, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you."